Good evening and welcome to Poems On. I'm Al Basile, and this is the fifth show of the third season. And our theme tonight is the inner life. My guests are David Cashman, the returning guest, and our new guest is Zara Raab. So good evening and welcome to you too.
Thank you, Al.
Sure. So as I always like to do, I'm going to ask Zara, you as the new guest, to start the ball rolling. So what do you have for us first?
I'm going to read a pantun. It's called My Shadow. Adieu, we two. The shadows out of sight at noon. At night attend the meadows where all our bones cocoon. Out of sight at noon. At night these umbral fellows, dressed all in black, will croon. I there among the willows. At night each umbral fellow, each a provocateur, tempts me to picadillos, my shade and me, adieu. With each provocateur spelled only by the light, I dance a pas de deux on any moonlit night. And once unspelt by light, like some soothsaying widow, one dreamy, moonless night, I'll say adieu, my shadow.
Wow,
That's
thank
lovely.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's lovely.
Thank you.
So obviously, this is a very particular form, and for people who are listening who don't have the poem in front of them, will you just explain to them and actually to us, because I've never written one, what the requirements are for a pantun?
Well, this is only loosely a pantun, but what the form requires is that certain lines get repeated in each stanza. So there's the first stanza, and the second stanza begins by repeating the second and fourth lines of the first stanza. They appear as the first and third lines of the second stanza, and then in each ensuing stanza, the second of the I'm sorry. Right, the lines get repeated in that way. The second and fourth lines get repeated as the first and third. But I have varied the lines so that they aren't strictly repetitive. I'm trying to keep the poem moving towards a denouement. But you see how certain words are repeated. Out of sight of noon. And then the word, well, instead of cocoon, I use will croon.
Yeah,
And so
you know, the overall effect of all the repetition is to create a kind of it's almost a trance-like effect. You know,
yeah.
that it's a little bit chant-like, and it creates this kind of mysterious atmosphere that's very appropriate to the subject matter. And also, you do interesting things with the flipping around of some of the words required by the repetition. So, you know, umbral, for example, is not, I mean, it's a word you're going to use in a poem about shadows, but the idea of the way that you change on the pas de deux and the adieu and I mean, it's a kind of a transformation of the words and the lines as you know as we go through, and then when you bring it to a close, I mean, the only point where we really say goodbye on a permanent basis to our shadow is when we're really gone. I assume that's where you were bringing this.
Yes. Yes. Right.
So it's only the first of what are going to be quite a few of the poems that we're going to read tonight that deal with either mortality or advancing age or the different parts of our lives as they advance. It's kind of a good way to start.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Dave.
Zara, I have just a general question about your work and your choice to work in forms as strictly as you do, or at least as faithfully as you do. I'll say. Do you find the form an engine for your content, or you do? Yeah,
Yes,
I can
in this
see
poem,
that.
my shadow particularly. And if the form isn't working as an engine, I will abandon it. I only use the form, and I have two, actually, it's unusual for me, two pantoons. And it was because because I was able to repeat with variations the French adieu to pas de Dieu to adieu. So the two and the dancing is two and the goodbye was sort of, and then the playing with the other words, cocoon to croon and so on, and the different uses of the light. So it seemed ideal for that. But yes, to answer your question briefly, yes.
the the thing my reaction to this poem in particular, I just couldn't get Wallace Stevens out of my head at all.
Oh,
Hearing this poem, even though you have a first person speaker here, which as far as I know he doesn't do, but you get that same kind of ironic distance from anything that would smack of sentimentality or anything like that, by that kind of Stevensonian impersonation of a of a
oh.
particular kind of speaker.
Now
Yeah.
that's interesting because I didn't feel this poem was particularly distant. I felt it was really me because I do have shadows in my life, and I felt it was really me grappling with them. Uh,
No, I understand that, and what I mean is that the elevation of the language, creates a distance that enables you to get to themes that you might shy away from if you
well,
didn't
yes, I
have
suppose
that
that's true. Yes,
kind of
but
distance. Yeah.
yes, but uh, distance, but not aloofness. I think not. Uh, I wouldn't use the word distance. I think it's more a kind of, it makes it into a kind of song
Hmm.
that allows for a certain level of abstraction, but I really don't feel that it's aloof, uh,
Hmm.
if that's what you mean by distance. But
I think I
anyway,
did.
but I appreciate your comments. They're helpful.
I see it more as a matter of it's a kind of coolness. And there's an even-handed tone that allows you to talk about these very personal things. I mean, what's more personal than you and your own shadow? I mean, there was a good song written about it once, after all.
Yeah.
Oh, anyway, it's a great way to get us going because it's so. I mean, it's a poetic poem. It's got an awful lot of things in it that poetry does. So good way to get going. I can be very conversational in my poem, so I like the fact that this is elevated. So I'm going to point the big spotlight at you then, David. How are you going to carry the ball here?
Well, I'm going to read a poem entitled "They Have Gone into the Dark Cold Water." Um, yeah, just to backtrack a little bit, Al, your point about how while you frequently or almost always write in forms, your diction is so much more everyday than hers was in that poem. So it makes a that makes a nice contrast for me, I think. But anyhow,
Well, you're going to hear it soon enough. So yeah.
Yeah, I like the
so
con.
anyhow, I'll read this poem entitled "They Have Gone into the Dark Cold Water." They have gone into the dark cold water, the father and his child, and out beyond the first low breakers to a depth still not over their heads, where he can teach first the lesson of her own buoyancy, how she can kick up her feet, tipping herself into a horizontal plane above a salty dark that discourages looking, and she will float. She will float with her face turned skyward, fronting lessons she must reckon for herself, that the brightness too will mostly require closing her eyes, and beyond that all her learning, immersion, light and dark are smaller answers than the forever accompanying care, lifting her like seawater on the scaffolding of its arms.
Uh,
Thanks.
so you changed salt water to seawater.
I did that just now and it was a mistake.
Oh, so you mean it? So you mean it to be salt water?
I meant it to be salt water.
Okay. Well, if I can jump in right away, what I like about this is that it is about inner life, but it's about not about your own inner life. It's about the inner life of this child, and and you put yourself into her globe of awareness and show us what she becomes aware of and how she feels. And I just think that's great. So just off the top of my head, that's what hits me first.
Yeah, thanks, Al. This is Zara needs to know that Al and I exchange work quite regularly, and this is one he read a couple of years back that I had written a couple of years back, and you know how this is with a friend, Zara. You particularly right after you've composed something and you're very enthusiastic about it, and you give it to a friend, and, and they're not enthusiastic about it at all. and and Al sort of, not to make a bad pun here, but uh, he just sort of threw cold water on this, and it sent me back to the drawing board. So it's a little bit different than it was when he first read it, and I thought I'd start with it tonight just to see if the changes struck him as, insofar as he could remember them, as anything worthwhile. So
Well, the changes are significant enough that it was as though I were hearing it for the first time. And I certainly responded, I guess, shame on me, much more positively this time. So I feel good about that.
yeah, and Zara needs to know that he's never he's never openly negative. He just sometimes puts on this face of puzzlement, like, what, what are you trying to do?
I,
That's
I
about as hostile as Al's criticism ever gets.
very sweet man. I can't imagine him being hostile. What I like about this is the subject matter, which is not often addressed enough, not not addressed often enough in poetry, the relationship of a parent to a child, and here this incredible gift of the lesson of the buoyancy of her own body, and how just how significant that is. I think it's very moving. I like the poem a lot.
Thank you.
I do feel I have many poems about the mother child relationship. And I do feel here this is a particularly fatherly approach, in that you write, the brightness too will mostly require closing her eyes, and beyond that all her learning, immersion, light and dark are smaller answers than the forever accompanying care, lifting her like salt water. So it's that forever accompanying care, which is so important, and which a father does provide well beyond childhood. The call to daddy in the night or whatever by the 30-year-old. But for a mother, at least for a mother with her daughter, there's so much more in terms of the intimacy of conversation. So the accompanying care here is really quite, to use your word, distant in a way. I mean, he's providing the scaffolding, but there's not a one-on-one afternoon spent talking about the different aspects, which
Mhm.
mother is often a part of the experience with her daughter. So,
Yeah.
but I appreciate this poem very much. I like it. There aren't enough of these. It's beautiful.
Hmm.
And
Thank you.
crafted too. It's very,
I had just one tiny question, and that is about the last line. Is there, you could have said his arms.
No, and I've wrestled with that question now, and I guess I'll never stop wrestling with it. Um, I prefer its, I guess, currently, because
hair.
I like the idea that the care is beyond just him,
Yes.
if
Ah,
you will,
I,
is a
I think,
bigger thing than just something that he provides.
I like that. That's good. Yeah.
So
Did you read it that way, Zara?
yes. I'm sorry for interrupting. I hope I'm not messing up the tape. Yes.
No, not at all. Great.
I, I did. I like that. I think you need that little bit of distance there. The
Neat.
scaffold hair. It's the, yeah.
So, so we've gone from, although Zara characterized her pantoum as being loose, still, that's a formidable form to yoke yourself to. And now we come to a poem that is in, you'd have to call it free verse. So I like that we're establishing these poles in the landscape, that we're going to cover these different ways of approaching the poetic voice in this group of poems as we go through them. Well, so to that end, I'm going back in a way to what Zara did, because it's first person. But on the other hand, it's only in form in so much as it's blank verse. It's not rhymed carefully as her poem was. And if you saw it on the page, it looks like paragraphs, which is what a lot of my earlier work looked like. And it's quite an old poem. It's called "The Believer Has His Doubts." The winter winds have risen suddenly. The gusts unsettle sounds inside the house, as though some unknown creature wanted in. Unwilling as I am to mix the two, I sit, a shot glass full of single malt in my right hand, and brimming in my left a tumbler of nutmegged eggnog. I sip the whiskey first and hold it on my tongue. The vapor charges up behind my nose and bathes the brain in pungency of peat. I have an urge to cough and take a dram of nog, which silences the whiskey like a heavy snowfall drifting over leaves. I taste the pearly cream, the egg, the mild green grit of nutmeg. Then I draw my tongue up to the roof to suck it clean. I will not mix belief and doubt. And so repeatedly, deliberate, I name the poison, then in turn, the antidote. You're laughing, or you're chuckling at least.
Well, yeah, it's a chuckle of appreciation. You know, the metaphor at the end is just so clever that it makes me chuckle.
Well,
Yeah.
you know very well it was this is a real thing. So this is an example of the action preceding the metaphor, just as it does in the poem. It's like, as I was shifting back and forth between the whiskey and the eggnog, I was thinking, one quiets the other, and the other rustles up the first. And so, yeah, I don't always start with a metaphor and then, then come up with a way to illustrate it, or something, some parallel in real life. It starts in life, and things that happen suggest metaphor to me without my making any attempt for them to do so. So I just follow the bouncing ball.
Mhm.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, thanks. I don't know whether people, I guess this refers almost directly back, David, to what you said just a few moments ago about it's at the end of your poem, that you're wrestling with it, and you'll probably keep wrestling with it. But there are things in our lives that don't stay the way, that we change our minds, that sometimes we feel that we have faith, and other times we feel that we doubt. And we may make up our minds and find our minds being changed without our making any attempt to do so. And so that's where this came from, that this is one of those situations where you really swing between the poles. Sometimes that's what happens, just as at other times you stick with one feeling maybe for your entire life. That happens too.
Yeah.
Well, all right, that's enough about me. Let's go back to Zara.
Well, I do like this poem very much. So
Good. I'm glad. That was my hope.
drink it. I mean, is there a bit of Pascal's wager in there? I don't know. Maybe. Okay. I'll read another pen tune, unfortunately. It's called The Country Lane. A country lane. To see what I could see, I sought the fields of May. Before me, what would be the moments of the day. I drove the country lane, the fields to left and right. They felt the sleeting rain one old October night. The moments fall away. I drive on down the lane at one with ripening hay, whose time, like mine, will wane. Grains bending like a sea, wrote Keats, will fall by scythe. All I've left behind me is changed by this new life. Grains fall to him, the shearer, and lay upon a field. Sight altered in my mirror. Behind me, what must yield?
Yeah, thank you. So again, this is states, passing states in our lives. And we go at the beginning of the poem from Seeking May, just a few lines later into October. And then the image of the grain having been cut, lying in the field. So my question to you is, what kind of change are you ascribing to all that you've left behind you as you move on into a new life? I have my own ideas about what that means. But from there to the end, the idea of moving forward, changing what's gone before, it's an intriguing one to me. That seems to be what you're saying. Is that a fair reading?
Yes, it has to do with leaving a life behind, the life that I had on the West Coast, and coming to Massachusetts. And I remember quite distinctly the moment when this happened. I I was driving down a country lane, and I could see in the rearview mirror everything falling behind me, closing in the rearview mirror, the way it does when you're moving in a car. And I had this tremendous sense of leaving a life behind me, but also I knew that that life, and I've experienced again and again since being here, that life, well, everything about the past changed because I changed. I had to change. The life that I had then, the person that I was, had to yield to what I am now. And that includes everything about me in that life, everything about that life surrounding me also yielded. The past we rewrite as we go into a new era. Literally, in my case, I really felt that there was this tremendous change. I realized that the poem is it's almost Blakean. It's so simple. It maybe doesn't appeal to our need for a psychologically more nuanced way of writing. It's very, very simple. It's almost like a parable, really. But I liked the idea of I I don't know. It just spoke to me.
Hmm. Well, thanks for confirming that, because the way that I read it's exactly what you say. What you just enlarged on is there. That's what's said in the poem. And it is kind of Blakean, isn't it? And it's certainly in the musicality of it and the language of it, the short lines, it's got the technical similarities, but also there's something about the imagery that reminds me a little bit of him. I don't know, but did you have the same take on it, David, as I did, or did you have the same question, or was it clear to you?
Um, well, I think I had this, maybe the same question. I was a little puzzled um, by the content, but it was so elegant. I was willing to be, I was willing to be puzzled by it. And now understanding it a little better, I think it's a really profound kind of insight that our pasts aren't static, right? Our pasts aren't static. We change them, we rewrite them all the time.
And our feelings them change
Yeah,
profoundly. So
yeah,
Yeah, that's what jumped out at me, was that it is this kind of statement that runs counter to this sort of conventional way of looking at the past, that, what's done is done. Well, maybe what's done is not what was done.
exactly. Well said.
So wow. Well,
Thank
great.
you.
Now, but you don't have any more pantoums for us.
No,
Okay.
no more.
They're fascinating. It's not a form I've ever tackled, but boy, it's
And
an
this
interesting one.
very loose, of course. It really diverges. You could almost say, I think some formalists I know would say, well, it's not a pantoon. It is, but it came from writing in that way.
Yeah, well, whether it follows the form strictly or not, the result of your engaging with, even if it's just the loose idea of the form, is to produce this tone that has this real authority and power. So, I mean, to me, this is what, and David, I know, you're not a slave to form the way some of the rest of us are, but that's really what form you hope the form is going to help you get to. And it doesn't matter how you get there, but you've gotten there, and that's what matters. So, yeah, great. You're up, sir.
all right. I'm going to read next what for me is a longer poem. It's almost a page. Again, it's well, you'll see the water imagery here is perhaps makes it somewhat similar to the first poem I read. This is entitled Going In. Going in. An old man, now on spindly sticks, his balance uncertain, goes down to the beach the heaviest surf day of the season. He can barely hear himself for the thunder of the waves and the freight train wind. He leaves his hat, t-shirt, towel, sandals, and prescription sunglasses in the dunes and makes his way through the noise to the water's edge. With no hesitation, he tries to wade out, but the rough shove and draw of the waves and the short intervals between knock him down before he's in up to his waist. No matter. He is long familiar with the spinning barrel of days and sea and storm and tide, and he knows to push off nimbly when his toes brush the bottom. He knows, too, to maintain the wheeling, alternating stroke of his arms, the full-grown crawl of a man who has made it all the way from the crawling days of his infancy. His fearless effort has somehow attached him to a force below the surface, and strangely now he goes forward faster. A few people on the beach notice the old man making for the breakers, not to climb the high wall of a wave and have its tonnage fall on him for full force, but rather to dive into its very face, to go as deep as he can under it all in darkness until the very air embracing his heart lifts him to a tranquil surface. The curtain of the breakers drawn, the battering noise behind, he makes for a new landing in a smooth calm, beyond, beyond.
Thanks.
Wow. This is powerful.
Talk about a metaphor. I mean, that's another one that's really triggered by the natural world. I mean, those forces do act on us in exactly the way you describe. And perhaps they do out of the water as well.
Yeah. Yeah, the poem I'll read next after this is also based on a water image too. I don't know. I it's a mystery how the inner life for me connects to the water life, but it does somehow. So
Well, you've had more time around on the water lately, right? So
yeah, um, yeah. Um, what was I going to say? And so, in a way, this poem is a flip uh, in some ways of the first one I read, because here the protagonist is old, and
yes,
in the first one, the subject of the poem is a youthful person.
I I took him to be seeking something beyond. I thought he wanted to die and that he was choosing suicide. I thought he was going into the beyond, that he
I,
no.
I
I that that's speculative and it's not totally in there, but I wondered
no,
about it. No, not at all.
not I wouldn't I
Okay.
wouldn't eliminate that, Zara, but my own sense of how the poem ends is not maybe in a reflection, or maybe in the same sense that your poem does, that it's I just wanted to write about going into the future, and
Yeah.
and whether that is it's certainly not a suicidal poem in that that's what the character is seeking, but it may well involve death, but it's just that idea of going into the face of this powerful wave to whatever is beyond.
Right.
yeah. I took it as a kind of as a form of transcendence, and there are forms of transcendence that we live through during our lives, but you can also see death as a kind of transcendence as well. So my reading kind of included both of those possibilities. Um,
Yeah, having dived through the face of that wave and having it break behind him, he comes up in a tranquil calm. So it's certainly not it's not a depiction of death that's negative, or that's clearly negative or frightening or
yeah,
anything
even
like that.
if you read it that way, yes,
Yeah, yeah,
right, yep. Well, like I
Okay.
say, it's transcendence.
Um,
yeah,
I thought the tranquility could be ambiguous. I mean, there is a tranquility to the act of letting go. But I hear you. I see that. I
I mean,
realize.
there are different kinds of oblivion, basically.
Right.
You can, but
I I, I like the way I like these lines. His fearless efforts has somehow attached him to a force below the surface. And strangely now he goes forward faster. It's interesting.
Well, that's a real force, right? He gets caught in the undertow, right?
Yeah, but the way, you know, how when the wave rises like that, it's pulling water along the bottom of the beach at that time. And
To
so
feed it.
to feed it. So if you were underneath the cresting wave, you would be pulled out at a faster speed.
Yeah, that was. It's been a long time since I've frolicked at the beach, because as you well know, I don't float even in salt water. But when I was a child and more buoyant, I remember these feelings of exactly what you're describing. So
But
yeah,
in the coast, we don't, it's not the same going to the beach, because in the western coastline, there is a drop off. There's
Mm.
quite sheer, so you're not going to be just swimming out and then it's a
oh,
different,
that's interesting.
yeah, no, it's a different experience. So it may be part of what's happening for me here is that difference in the coastlines. I have not really been swimming in the Atlantic. Um,
You'll
but
notice a difference right away if what you just described is what you're used to.
yeah, it's,
It's dangerous. The undertow can be deadly.
yeah, but the West is dangerous in different ways because you have the cliffs and you have, to fall off of. There are a lot of
Ah,
cliffs. Yeah.
wow.
But anyway, I love the poem. It's very powerful, I think.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah, you're
title,
getting.
yeah.
Please go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I just was noting the title is The Going In is a good title. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry.
you got a lot of inspiration from your time down in Jamestown, Mr. Cashman. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, that's a wonderful chunk of New England coastline there. This is Zara, this is a town on the coast of southern coast of Rhode Island that my daughter and her family have recently taken up residence. Where my daughter and her family have recently taken up residence. So yeah, it's a wonderful spot.
Neat.
Nice.
Yeah, and you've been there more than before they moved there.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, we knew it a long. We've known it for a long time.
nice. Well, I don't have anything along the same lines, so I have to change direction a bit. But if it's fair to say that the inner life, that one's identity, of course, is the foundation of one's inner life, then this extended metaphor about identity certainly fits with this theme that I cooked up for us. And this is called The Tree That Didn't Know It Was a Fruit Tree. The tree that didn't know it was a fruit tree grew up in a grove of evergreens, shy about the shaping of its leaves, unneedle-like, and shocked to see them fall in that first season and to stand denuded, open to the winter wind, surrounded by pines and firs, secure and durable, cloaked in close green with silver underneath. Flush in the spring, astonished by its budding, the new growth answers with a brighter shade the somber questions coloring its neighbors. Then, taken unawares by blossoming and gaping at its petals, pink and white, it keeps a secret in the mystery of pollen, to be visited by bees who find their way to it unerringly, to share that secret in a distant place. It marvels as a different change ensues from pollinated blossom into fruit, which swells and ripens through to harvest time. What is this crop that bumps against the carpet of crackling brown, and settles down upon the layered needles of the forest floor. It doesn't understand the rot that follows, the role that beauty plays, fruits ripening into a sweetness, why they had to die to make way for new life. Among its neighbors, alien and ill-equipped to know its mission while it thinks itself alone, it stands as animals approach and nibble at its gifts, to leave the bitten cores behind. Ahead, the site of future orchards. That's for us artistic folk.
Very nice. I like the crop that bumps against the carpet of crackling brown and settles down upon the layered needles of the forest floor. You have it just right there, how the needles are crackling.
Well, you know, you may not know, Zara, but David knows very well that I grew up in a park in Massachusetts that was about 90% evergreens, with here and there birches or a few other kinds of trees that were not evergreen. And the whole idea of the essence of an evergreen, of a tree that keeps it doesn't have leaves, but has needles and keeps them. And then when they fall, of course, I've spent a lot of time walking over those brown needles and hearing and feeling that crackle underfoot. So it wasn't hard for me to summon it up. But evergreens are strange trees, aren't they? I mean, if your idea of a tree is that thing that drops its leaves and maybe produces fruit, but it's changed from season to season, an evergreen is a strange thing indeed. So that's where all of this started was. And then I thought, well, you know, if you were a fruit tree and you didn't know, and you, there are all these stories of children growing up in circumstances different and not understanding that their background is not the same as the people that they're growing up around, whether they're adopted or something like that. That there are, if you don't know what you are because everything around you is one way and you're not that way, and you've never seen anyone else like you, what would that be like? And that's where the whole extension of the metaphor spooled out. So, and the little thing at the end about how the animals come and nibble your fruits, and it's like we all have readers, but we don't really know where they take the things that we've written. They carry them in their lives somewhere else, maybe. And that's what the last line is about, that maybe we will have some kind of a continuing link or impact in a different part of the forest altogether when we're not around. I guess that's part of the dream of not every artist, but some of them for sure.
Well, particularly poets like yourself, Al, that have been teachers for a long time, I think.
Yeah, and also that don't have children and have to rely on leaving trails behind to kind of testify to who they were, because there isn't anyone to come after them to tell their story but themselves.
Yeah, I'm moved by the loneliness of this tree. Because it is unlike all the trees around it. It doesn't know what to expect from life at all.
Right.
It has no mentors. It has no seniors at all. I find that very moving. And then the fact that it's a fruit tree You know, what's more glorious in the tree world than a fruit tree, you know, that can produce fruit that's wonderful and that nourishes, you know, others. Yeah. You're a smart guy, Alan, you know that.
Well, I hope I'm guilty as charged, but one never knows. Um, but yeah, I, because you know me as well as you do and have, you know that the way that this metaphor is written does isolate this particular tree.
Mm.
But I've been very fortunate in my life to have kind of carried my tree over to places where there are other trees like me.
Right.
And that's one of the great things about this, about Poems On, is that I'm able to interact with real peers who are themselves fruit trees. All the fruits are not identical, but the mechanism is not so different.
Mhm.
And that's not so lonesome. But I was also partly writing this for exactly that, for those children who feel completely out of touch with the world around them, and who then may not be able to recognize as they change that the changes that they see are not a bad thing, but are part of their becoming a
Yes.
wonderful thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
So it'd be a different poem if there were other fruit trees hanging around in the forest, but this is all twisted up to that height for the benefit of, because there are people, children, not just children, there are adults out there who don't feel that they belong at all anywhere.
Yeah, I'm with
right.
you. I think that's I I I wonder if a fruit tree, I mean, this is not really about the poem, but I wonder it would be possible for a fruit tree to live among the evergreens because of the perpetual shade. But
Yeah.
I the poem moving. It's a variation on, it's the ugly duckling in a way, but
Yeah.
it's a new, it's it's fresh. It's yeah.
And I
It's
grew up around trees, so that's where my language is grounded.
yeah.
You know, growing up it was 250 acres. It was a very large park.
Is it still there, that part?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. It's Winnikinny Park,
Okay.
and there are two lakes on the park. The Canosa Lake. There's a hill on the top of which is a stone castle, an actual castle that was built by a doctor, an American doctor who visited England and saw these pocket castles that housed one family. Not a very large castle, but made of stone with parapets. And I've written about that castle and going in there, and I
Yeah.
think you've even heard the parapet is a
Right.
poem of mine about that castle. So yeah, it was it was a I mean, it's a great place to grow up for anybody, but if you happen to become somebody looking for metaphor, you're well provided with inspiration. So great.
Cool.
Well, let's turn the dial back to you, Zara.
Oh dear. Okay. I'm going to read Feathered Rain. Says William Strode, the feathered rain falls lightly now on our small town, that time will take away as days stack up like this. The New York Times, the late edition, shelved away. Steam heat has fogged the library glass. Outside, a grinding, wide-mouthed plow heaves heavy snow aside in mounds. I turn the page and read, see how, backs to the camera, unshuttered beneath the sun, men work a row. They pick and bend and pick again, soil laced with chlorpyrifos. Below the fold, a Trenton bridge, smelted in furnaces that sear the earth all round. And here, two girls, young faces partly veiled, they peer out from a field of deepest green, not crops, for they have seen the plow, but UN tents for refugees. I turn my gaze back to the snow. How quiet snow, as slumberous, I ponder all the graveyard stones that crowd the hills above my house. Who wouldn't soon run out of rooms, feathering a nest, unfeathering? The flakes, no two alike, still fall. Slow crawls the yawning roadside truck. Slow falls the glittering veil.
Wow.
What a trip. You take us on a trip.
I spent the afternoons reading in the library, in the cold winters.
Well, the contrast, the inner life, the reading, what you see in the Times, and the outer, the outer life, the outer world. It's you're inside this kind of sealed globe. I think part of the power of this poem is that you simply state what you see in the Times. You don't editorialize. You don't even indicate by your tone how the things that you see are affecting you. They're there. It's as though we're in your place and we're permitted to respond any way we like because you haven't interceded to give us an interpretation. And I don't know if that was intentional, but I find it very effective. Did you do it on purpose?
That's something I did want. I see there's a typo, William Strode, a capital S. Yes, I did want that. I mean, you could see this was a time, well, reading the Times practically any time. This was actually in 20, probably 17. There's so much corruption and so that's where you do get the feathering a nest, unfeathering. I mean, that was my little bit of editorializing at the end there.
Okay.
So it was sort of a depressing, but I didn't think I needed to editorialize. I mean, what you saw in the paper, just reading the captions of the photographs without even, was enough to
Yeah.
out the world. And then outside the glass, the snow falling and just covering everything with its crystalline surface. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's the contrast is what gives it its special power, because the middle part of the poem where we're seeing the things in the newspaper has its impact, but then to frame it in this, I mean, those of us who've grown up in the Northeast and are used to winters have a complicated relationship with snow. I think that particularly if you grow into adulthood, because when you're a child, it's exciting and it means the end of school and you don't do the shoveling yourself. And so, and you play in it and, you do these things. And in another poem David is going to read, we see his dog sticking his snout in the snow. And so there are all kinds of joy that we associate with snow, but at the same time, there's that forbidding nature, and there's there's a sense of being enclosed and immobilized And so you have and then later you become the person that's got to shovel and deal with it and watch it get dirty. And so I think that we all have a kind of a love-hate relationship with snow, unless we become skiers and people like that develop a different kind of connection. So yeah, I mean, my imagination is framing at the beginning and the end of this poem imagery that's very, very strong in me. So you had that going for you, whether you knew it or not.
Also, I have to say the poem is very much inspired by discovering this phrase by William Strode, who I think is from like the 17th century or something. This description of rain, of snow as feathered rain, is quite wonderful, I thought.
Mm.
I mean, it's just, who would have thunk feathered rain?
Well, not only had I never heard feathered rain, I never heard of William Strode.
Well,
So this,
he is in Bartlett's familiar quotations, which is where I came across this
okay.
totally by accident while looking for something else. I do want to point out to the third stanza. I have written. You say I don't editorialize here. I have written poems that do editorialize about women, and of course, they're not very effective. But here I simply mention these two girls, and it's my way of just, please notice this. There are these two girls. I mean, the workers in the second stanza have it rough. There they are, picking and bending. They're working though. They're using
Right.
their bodies. They're being poisoned by the whatever, but they're using their bodies. They're agents of their own bodies. But the girls in the third stanza are peering out from a tent, a UN tent. And I don't know how much agency they have. Probably not a lot, given their circumstance. So I just, please note, I know just that's there, and it was important to me to have it there.
Mm.
And it was part of why I wrote the poem.
Yeah.
That and rain and just, yeah. Anyway.
Well, partly veiled is telling
Yeah.
too, isn't it?
Yeah. Like the
Yeah, it's clear that you mean us to take note, or you're underlining this moment, this image, but without preaching.
Thank you. Thanks.
But
Yeah.
but the end of stanza 2, and even more the end of stanza 3, are these stark crimes that human beings make against each other and the natural world. Perhaps because of all the snow I've seen in my lifetime, when I encounter a poem that begins with such a beautiful phrase as feathered rain, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a beautiful poem about the snowfall in winter. And then the pesticide pollution and the displacement of these refugees just hits me in the face. And when I get to the last line, the glittering veil, I just think that's so evocative, Sarah, because it's so ambiguous. Is it a beautiful silent covering to the landscape, or is it this covering over of something that's horrific? That's horrific. Yes. Is it the covering over something that's horrific?
Well,
Yeah. This is, I don't know how you feel about your ultimately about your editorializing poems, but to me, this is a wonderfully successful editorial without being overly didactic or preachy.
right. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That's what makes it effective to me. Um,
Absolutely.
you allow us. It partakes of the same kind of dynamic that certain kinds of art do, like a radio play, where you've got to provide your own imagination. You're given part of it, but then you have to engage and fill out, and you've got to draw your own conclusions, even though they're there very, very much in plain sight, but they're not. And you draw our attention to them, but you don't tell us how we're supposed to feel. So that I think that's the way to do it if you want to make a point, because we're living in an age where there's so much empty preaching that people don't listen to it, except for the ones that are only listening to it. So, wow, great. Now I want to learn more about William Strode, because that is a very original image, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
My model here was, now I can't think of the name of it. It's the famous poem by Robert Lowell about, it starts with the aquarium, that's about civil rights and the special regiment that went down to the South, and you'll know what I mean if you think about it. I can't, the title has escaped me, but anyway, thank you. Let's go on to the next.
Well, David, you're up.
David.
Okay. More water here, I guess. I'll read a poem called Some Miles Off the Familiar Shore. Some miles off the familiar shore, his modest but insistent engine, loyal to the end, idled back, quit. The bow settled down into a pillowing calm, the main. With no power of its own, the hull became a vein, and a whisper of wind set him right, aligned his true bearings, his true coordinates. The time to take the measure of his cargo was scant but sufficient. The lines of verse, both written and collected over a lifetime, filling now his small craft to the gunwales. All the grand music swelling now to a silent content. The vast murals of sea and continent mounting now into an overarching wave of forgiveness. He faced head on into its gentle whiteness, suffered its embracing curve, and went on.
Boy, there's an awful lot of summing up in today's poems.
Yeah.
Just as a quick aside, I noticed that you're doing this in the last couple of poems, where you don't have a title per se. You launch right into the poem at the end of the. I mean, you're already in the poem as you're reading the title.
Yeah.
Is that a new thing, or?
No, I've done that. I don't do it it's not a feature of the majority of poems that I've written, but I do it fairly often. I like just to launch into the body of the poem after, to give it a meaning, to give the poem a meaningful title, and then to carry on from that immediately.
Ah, interesting.
So yeah.
Well, again, with the metaphors.
Yeah, we're we're out on the water on a boat this time. So.
Well, he's throwing, these are manuscripts he's throwing into the water? Wait, have I missed the?
No, it's just what I was trying to say was that in this craft, that's the content of of his life. The lines that he's written, the ones he's collected. Yeah, and now the sort of engine that um, the engine that's pushed him in a line of his own choosing has failed him. And the wind has, if you've been out in a canoe on a lake and you stop paddling, the wind will just push the bow of the canoe around, and you'll have to go the way the wind wants you to go. That's
Yeah.
kind of the point this
Wow.
fellow's at.
Yeah, but the language that you deploy at that moment is interesting to me, because you say aligned his true bearings, his true coordinates, as though the choices that he made when his engine had not yet failed him, that took him in a direction of his own, is in a way a movement separate from and away from his true nature, and that he only comes back to his true nature when he allows himself to be aligned with the current or the wind or whatever. So in other words, nature, which is guiding him at this point, becomes his true nature. Does that make sense?
I think that's very fair. But it's somewhat of a bit of it's maybe more simple than I think it. I think we're all making so many mistakes all the time with and and in the end, perhaps one can just see one's energy for all that crazy stupidness that you've pursued. Your energy for it fails you, and you're pushed by and I will say this, you're pushed by a more benign force, perhaps, towards where what you should have been like all along or something.
Very good.
That's what I was trying to say.
That's very nice. I like that.
Yeah, I like it too. Well, I mean, it's an extension of a certain kind of faith that we don't see all that often, because particularly in this society, we celebrate independence, striking out on your own path, being different from everybody else, choosing your direction. It's all about making things happen as opposed to allowing things to happen to you. And so you're making a real statement about what is deeper and ought to be preferable, even though we very often don't allow it to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Well, you're a philosopher. Wow. Yeah, of course, there is no resolution at the end. Although there's a state that's reached that's very, again, I called it a summing up. It is kind of a, if a destination can also be a state of being, it's a state of being that feels like a place you want to stay in because it's like a destination. The overarching wave of forgiveness, of course, is a beautiful element to introduce at this point. And it's important. And it's another thing that we don't see given the correct amount of attention in the modern world. So, I mean, I'm always grateful for the size and the openness of your spirit in personal terms, but also in your work. So, because it is of a piece. You are the way you appear in your work. And that's partly why I thought that it would be a good combination to get you two to get to know each other through your work, because, I think we all have some similar concerns. So, wow. All right. Well, then I guess I have to, I'm going to go in this direction, which sometimes I get, I hope it's not, I'm not being preachy, but I do lecture sometimes. The teacher in me thinks that it's okay to lecture. I think that maybe the poetry audience per se is not as accepting of that idea, but I do it anyway. So there we go. And so this is called deep unawareness. And this really is about our nature, the nature of our inner life and our consciousness and what makes us who we are, what makes us, what kinds of creatures we are, conscious creatures, and what that means. This is called deep unawareness. The fall was into consciousness. In Eden, we had an animal's awareness, saw the world, but not ourselves as part of it. Then we sensed that we were separate, with an inner and an outer view. The eye was born that changes everything it looks at by supposing we are different. So each of us was broken and divided. And in that moment, we first felt alone. We pay for what we brought into the world, our part of nature pondering itself. This is the price of our inheritance. Call it sin, but we didn't commit it. Call it a curse, but no one put it on us. This sense of being always at a distance. And so we long to lose ourselves again, to drop back in the ocean of unknowing, to be relieved of what we have to see, to drown our consciousness so deeply we forget ourselves, forget the world, immersed in love or some similar obsession. If we're not careful, we are led astray and tempted by oblivion, destroy our lives. But we can also learn to heal. The athlete in the zone, the instant each inventor sees the light, the artist's hand not guided by her will, but moving surely, her feeling that she can't make a mistake. These are the moments when we're most ourselves, made whole again, and in a state of grace.
Beautiful.
In an earlier version of the poem, when I got to the part about trying to forget ourselves and forget the world, and the laundry list of obsessions that people get hung up on, from gambling to drugs to anything that we get so attached to that we forget ourselves, and that feeling of forgetting ourselves seems good to us, but at the same time, the activity itself is not good for us. I had a whole bunch of stuff in there about ways that we can hurt ourselves by trying to seek a kind of unconsciousness, and then I just cut it all out because I think we all know that stuff.
How recent is this?
Last few months, within the last maybe 3 months. This is one that's not, I've been reading from my books, but this one is new. It's in the new group. That'll eventually end up in the next book, I hope. But yeah, this is Tim Steele. I took a workshop with him early on at Westchester, and he said, well, some of the time you write these little essays in verse.
This is an essay in verse. Yeah.
And that's kind of what it is.